Greetings to my fellow companions of planet Earth. This is a very important message and video compilation, which will shed light on the truth about the New World Order. The New World Order is now halfway complete and being played out in front of our eyes. Some people are unaware of what the New World Order actually is. The rise of the new empire, China, is the main focal point for the New World Order. Every empire that has existed has always fallen. The puppet masters have systematically destroyed the American empire from within. This was their plan all along, to create such a debt in America that it can never be repaid, resulting in a burst of the bubble and the collapse of the dollar, which will allow China to become the new empire. China is a brutal totalitarian country. Have you heard of the Great Firewall in China? It's complete censorship of the internet so the leaders can literally control the type of information that you absorb. This is total death of knowledge expansion. Within the next 25 years China will implement its Great Firewall throughout the world to prevent people from expanding their minds. China wants other countries around the world to govern the internet in the same way it does. A new report from the International Cyber Policy Center, ICPC, has warned the world will be under total control and any shred of freedom that we do currently have will be stripped away and never returned. China is the most slave labor in the entire world. The workers get paid in crumbs while also working intense long-hour shifts. One of Apple's biggest technology suppliers in China named Foxconn had 14 of its workers kill themselves due to the sheer high rate of slave labor work. A woman working at the Apple factory was only getting paid $304 a month, and that is after doing 12-hour shifts. This is a quote by Jim Rogers. Teach your children or your grandchildren Chinese. It is going to be the most important language of their lifetimes. Welcome to the New World Order, and remember, China is the New World Order.
But we're not attempting to develop offensive biological weapons like that Chinese laboratory was doing.
At some point there probably will be a pandemic with a high mortality rate. There's debate about like what's high, but I mean like something that's killing a lot of 20-year-olds, let's say.
Right.
Like it's.
Yes.
If you had like Ebola type of mortality.
Spanish flu, something that attacks the immune systems of healthy people.
But it's like killing large numbers of young healthy people. That's define that as like high mortality. Then this is at least practice for something like that.
War with China. It sounds unthinkable. But according to many experts, the countdown may be on. China's President Xi Jinping is shaping up to the West like never before. And just last week, a major new military alliance was announced between the US, Australia and the UK to counter Chinese aggression in the Pacific.
The first major initiative of AUKUS will be to deliver a nuclear-powered submarine fleet for Australia.
America and its allies are preparing for a battle we didn't think was possible.
The idea that China would never attack, even never invade, well, I wouldn't count on that.
Xi Jinping is already on a collision course with his own people. From recently outlawing boy bands to enforcing propaganda lessons in primary schools. Xi Jinping is taking control, and he's prepared to fight for it even beyond his homeland. If this unimaginable conflict were to happen, it would begin with an invasion of Taiwan, the tiny nation off its coast that China has long believed is theirs.
Once they make the decision to do this, they will come full bore, like a crazy man with an axe.
Control of Taiwan would give China a huge new military reach over the Pacific.
That would put Australia in the firing line pretty quickly.
But is Australia putting itself in the firing line by talking too tough to China?
It is very dangerous to frame China as like worse than Darth Vader.
Tonight, we investigate just how close to war we really are.
The question of whether or not to go to war may well end up getting decided for us.
So is resistance futile?
We should not, to borrow a phrase from Game of Thrones, bend the knee to Beijing.
Good evening, I'm Liz Hayes, and this is Under Investigation. Joining me tonight, 5 experts who each bring a lifetime's experience to their views on war with China.
We've got to ask ourselves the question, do you want your children or their children to live in an authoritarian world where democracy is on the ash heap of history and states no longer have freedom of speech, freedom of thought? Or is democracy worth defending?
China has been preparing for war for at least 3 decades. Its whole military modernization has largely been aimed towards having a war over Taiwan.
I think that war with China should be unthinkable and should remain unthinkable, because when we talk about war with China, we're talking about the potential for a level of casualties and destruction that this country has certainly never experienced and would be devastating for people across Asia.
I do think it is very dangerous to frame China as completely evil, only malevolent. Yes, there is a bad China, where China does things that we find unacceptable. But I think it's really important for Australia to accept that there is also a good China. There are things that China does and can do that are for the benefit of the world.
Clinton Fernandez, you would argue that it's time for ordinary Australians to be aware of this.
Absolutely. I think it's very important that this debate occur. I'm glad it's occurring here. War is an extremely serious matter. It will shape the destiny of the world for the next 75 years.
There's no doubt Australia has been engaged in a war of words with China on human rights and, more recently, the origins of COVID-19.
It remains Australia's firm view that understanding the cause of this pandemic has nothing to do with politics. It's essential for preventing the next one.
And China has bitten back, hitting us with punishing trade sanctions. Tensions and rhetoric are escalating. Earlier this year, a senior Australian security official warned of the beating drums of war coming from China, echoed by Defence Minister Peter Dutton.
I don't think it should be discounted. I think China has been very clear about that goal.
So, are we unnecessarily antagonising a superpower and major trading partner? Are we talking ourselves into a war? Or are we bravely standing up to an aggressive China?
Australia has shown the world how one deals with the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party in particular.
Colonel Grant Newsham is a China specialist and former head of intelligence for the US Marine Forces in the Pacific.
Biggest complaint about the Australians is that there's not 10 times as many of them. They were the first ones to stand up and say, no, we're not going to put up with this. Australia's future is, you're going to have to fight for it if you want to keep it. And the idea that China would never attack, even never invade, well, I wouldn't count on that.
But Australia is making a very expensive enemy. Our war of words with China is already costing us billions in exports every year. And at a time when Australia is ramping up its defence budget to be better prepared for any conflict with China.
I just think it's tremendously ironic that we choose to lead the world in being tough on China, where we're so economically vulnerable. The military upgrades that we're talking about, the extra spending on our defence forces, we can afford this stuff because of our really profitable trade with China.
Is that true, Malcolm?
The decision to spend money on defence is based on threat perception. And that threat perception is focused exclusively on a rising China. We no longer have 10 years strategic warning time for a major attack on this country. The ball is in their court. They need to actually realise that they are responsible for the crisis that we're now in, not us.
Historian Dr. David Brophy believes the smarter strategy would be to engage with China, because he thinks a war-weary America may not have the stomach for more conflict, even if it is in our backyard.
America's position is slipping. And I think it's really unthinkable for a lot of people in Canberra, particularly in the defence sector, that Australia could be left alone without America in the neighbourhood in a position to help out if Australia gets itself in trouble. But there is no military threat from China to Australia. I mean, I want to state that very clearly.
Look at China's stated goals. They claim all of the South China Sea. If China achieves that, the way the region operates changes fundamentally. China spends more on its military than the whole of Asia combined.
He's absolutely right. It's about Chinese domination of the Indo-Pacific region. And I don't think any Australian citizen would willingly embrace that sort of relationship with China. We should not, to borrow a phrase from Game of Thrones, bend the knee to Beijing.
But experts warn if words ever turn to war, Australians will pay a terrible price.
We're dealing with the potential for a conflict that could be much more impactful on ordinary Australians than anything we've seen in recent decades.
A former Australian soldier and diplomat, David Kilcullen, now leads the Future Operations Research Group, which looks at how coming wars are likely to play out. He fears Australia is already China's punching bag, Xi Jinping's way of sending his message to the US.
We are seeing not only an escalation of US and Chinese rhetoric against each other, but Australia increasingly being seen as a US ally that the Chinese feel they can push around to try to send a message to others.
John, are we seeing China bullying Australia into thinking, at least, that there's trouble coming?
The grand narrative of the Chinese Communist Party, certainly, is that, one, China is undeterrable. Two, its goals are fixed. And three, it will pay any cost to achieve those goals. Effectively to say, stay out of it because it is hopeless to put up any resistance, and you might as well stay on the sidelines and deal with China as China wants to be dealt with.
I do think it is very dangerous to frame China as completely evil, only malevolent. Trying to frame China as like worse than Darth Vader.
Yes, I agree with all of that, but at what point do you decide you can't just keep stepping back?
No, we shouldn't step back.
So is resistance futile? You know?
No, it's not futile. I just think this talk of war amongst the general Australian public makes people fearful, it makes people anxious, and unfortunately, I think it makes the prospect of more war more likely.
I think we can show as much nuance as possible and be as accommodating as possible and not mention the war word once, and they will still occupy the South China Sea, and they will still coerce their neighbours. It is China, after all, that rolls nuclear ballistic missiles through Tiananmen Square on National Day parades and tanks and displays their military might. And in speeches threatens that they'll bash the heads of Westerners against a Great Wall of Steel.
The Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully us. Anyone who dares to try will have their heads bashed bloody against the Great Wall of Steel.
This is incredibly nationalist war talk that the Chinese are using.
But this war of words is increasingly turning into confrontation. If there's to be a war with China, everyone agrees that the trigger will be Taiwan. The tiny island nation sitting off its coast that President Xi Jinping has already stated he wants incorporated into communist China.
Xi Jinping cannot afford politically to walk back from his commitment to take Taiwan. That would be the end of his power base, the end of his control.
The Chinese Communist Party claims Taiwan is historically part of China, which, strictly speaking, isn't true. The island has an indigenous population dating back thousands of years. A flourishing democracy, Taiwan would be an immense strategic and economic prize.
Last year, our radar stations have detected incursions by nearly 2,000 Chinese military aircraft and over 400 military vessels.
Not only would it give China a military footprint well into the Pacific Ocean, it would also give China fabulous wealth. Taiwan has the 6th largest foreign exchange reserve in the world. And the island state supplies the bulk of the world's semiconductor computer chips, critical to most modern manufacturing products, from washing machines to cutting-edge weaponry. And it's sitting there, out of China's clutches, with America's backing.
Why does China need Taiwan so badly?
Taiwan is the veritable unsinkable aircraft carrier from which China can project military power deep out into the Central Pacific. Taiwan demonstrates to the world that you can have prosperity and democracy.
Taiwan is definitely a prize. I mean, firstly, it's a challenge, an ideological challenge to the one-party state system of China. But there's also a deeply emotional sense that is motivating China's leadership.
Since it was created in 1949 after the Chinese Civil War, Taiwan has never officially declared its independence from China. Doing so, according to our experts, would be an instant trigger for war.
If Taiwan does say it wants to be independent, what happens?
China will invade.
Simple as that.
Yep.
Those who warn of China's intentions for Taiwan point to the example of Hong Kong, which is now as good as taken over by the Chinese Communist Party after crushing pro-democracy demonstrations there. And there is no one who wants to protect Taiwan's independence more than its former Vice President, Madame Annette Lu, who spent years in jail fighting to establish the island's democracy.
So I think it's very immoral. If anyone has the interest in launching any kind of war at this critical moment of the earth.
Madame Lu proposes establishing what she calls a democratic commonwealth, comprising Taiwan, South Korea and Japan to balance China's power.
We can make a golden triangle in the region, and we also welcome Australia from the south, America, Canada from the other side of the Pacific. We all the peace-loving democracies.
Malcolm Davis believes Australia should stand up for a fellow democracy in our region, particularly if China should decide to invade Taiwan.
If we do not act in the face of a Chinese aggressive move against Taiwan, then morally and ethically, we have fallen off our pedestal. We have done the wrong thing. I think that we do need to think about the implications of the lives of 24 million Taiwanese. One only has to look at Xinjiang province, where there's over 1 million Uyghurs behind essentially barbed wire, just for being Uyghurs. You do not want the situation playing out in Taiwan where millions of Taiwanese are in essentially concentration camps.
I think as the world has seen from forays into Afghanistan, invasion is one thing. Keeping it, keeping control, managing a restive Taiwan population who have experienced democracy and feel passionately about democracy is going to be quite another.
Whether it wants to go to war for Taiwan or not, China is certainly ready for it, and ready to take on the US and anyone else who steps into the fight.
I've been watching China and the Chinese military coming up on 40 years now. And what you've seen really in the last 20 years is probably the world's biggest, fastest military buildup ever, not just since World War II, but perhaps in human history.
According to Colonel Grant Newsham, the former head of intelligence for the US Marine Forces in the Pacific, the scale of China's military buildup focused on Taiwan is unparalleled and alarming.
So, in your opinion, what are they doing? Are they preparing for a fight, or is this a deterrent?
Well, you first have to ask, who would it deter? Have you ever heard anybody say that they wanted to attack China? It's really for an offensive purpose, and the first thing they want to do is to get the Americans out of Asia, and the ultimate objective is global domination.
Some might be surprised to learn that the fate of America's economy has already been determined, verified, and announced by the Obama White House. Yet, it has received scant attention from the corporate media. In 2011, economist Kyle Bass interviewed a senior member of the Obama administration about its planned solutions for fixing the U.S. economy and trade deficit. Among the questions he asked was about the U.S. exports and wages. But the question itself was not nearly as important as the response he received from this senior administration official. In fact, this single 7-word response clarifies everything, explains everything, and leaves little else to discuss. We're just going to kill the dollar. There it is, the entire agenda in one short sentence. It explains everything we've been seeing domestically and globally. That one statement makes every other question irrelevant, or otherwise answers all economic questions and explains everything. Nothing else matters. I urge you to ponder that statement and all it implies. Doing so will provide you with the clarity to understand not only what is taking place today, but what is yet to come. It is important to note the specificity of the word kill. Stated in the active voice, it means an unambiguously intentional and deliberate act. Although it was reported in the New York Times, few have paid attention to last week's meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. But it was an extremely important event in terms of the planned murder of the US dollar.
The message coming out of China is getting louder by the day. It doesn't like other countries, especially Australia, ganging up and meddling in its affairs. As we know, Beijing is currently doing its best to punish us economically, but in the last few days, President Xi Jinping has also ratcheted up the rhetoric by warning of the perils of a new Cold War. A loose translation is, if we don't stop poking the panda, we'll face serious consequences. Now, it's worth taking that threat seriously because Xi controls the largest military force in the world, and as one of his supporters cautions tonight, the cost of conflict with China could be Armageddon. It's a prospect as terrifying as it is unthinkable. A military showdown between two nuclear-armed superpowers, the United States and China. A conflict that could reshape the world order. Is Australia vulnerable at the moment?
Australia is monstrously vulnerable at the moment. We have this naive faith that American military power is infinite, and it's not.
Tonight, leading minds on the looming war with China.
It's going to be waged on an economic front. It's going to be waged on a social affairs front. They're going to come at us all ways.
How likely is it? How prepared are we? And at what cost for us and the world?
Use all your imagination. Think about all the nightmares you can think of. And what will happen will be 10 times more than your worst nightmare. You are talking about the possibility of Armageddon.
Taipei is a modern metropolis, capital of Taiwan, an island half the size of Tasmania. yet home to a population just about the same as all of Australia. The trigger point for conflict with China, if it comes, is right here. Why do you think people in Australia should care about what's happening in Taiwan right now?
Because we are a democracy, and democracy do not survive in isolation.
Sin Cheng Xiao is an entrepreneur who runs a tech startup in Taipei. In recent months, he's grown increasingly nervous about China's growing threats to reunify with Taiwan, by force, if necessary. What is it particularly about Chinese rule that you're scared of?
Number one is losing all your freedoms, right? Because Taiwan has been enjoying, our democracy and our liberties, our freedoms for the past few decades. And it is just unimaginable that, we would be reunified with an authoritarian regime and then surrender such freedoms. So no, it's not an option.
For Xiao and many other Taiwanese, the crackdown on democracy in nearby Hong Kong is a warning of what may be to come.
They lost their basic right to vote, to elect their officials, to speak their minds, to protest. Hong Kong people just live under fear every single day. So we all hope that it doesn't come to this, right? Because Taiwanese would have to fight. And although we spend heavily on military equipment, we are no match for the second largest army in the world.
China is increasingly vocal about bringing what it views as a renegade province to heel, stepping up its warnings to the rest of the world not to meddle in its business.
Anyone who dares try to do that will have their heads bashed bloody against the Great Wall of Steel, forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people.
President Xi Jinping's hard line at the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party in July was followed by a record number of Chinese fighter planes breaching Taiwanese airspace, more than 150 incursions over just a 4-day period. The question is, if China does make a move on Taiwan, will the US respond? Right now, the answer seems to be yes.
I just want to make China understand that we are not going to step back. We are not going to change any of our views.
So are you saying that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked?
Yes, we have a commitment to do that.
Those who want to block China's unification with China's Taiwan will be doomed to failure.
Victor Gao is an expert in Chinese affairs and an unofficial mouthpiece for the regime in Beijing. Vice President of the Centre for China and Globalisation think tank, he's a former diplomat who was the interpreter for Communist leader Deng Xiaoping. If the US does intervene in Taiwan and Australia supports them, what will happen to Australia?
Listen, if Australia goes to fight together with the US soldiers in China's drive for reunification between China's mainland and China's Taiwan, then you are talking about the worst thing you can dream of. A war between China and the United States will soon escalate out of control, and that will be Armageddon, Armageddon, and Armageddon.
Alfred McCoy, welcome back to Democracy Now! So if you can talk about this summit, you wouldn't quite understand the kind of tension that is between the United States and China right now, the world's two largest economies. But if you can talk about the significance of this, and then how close we are to a Cold War or hot war with China.
The key issue in terms of immediate conflict between Washington and Beijing is Taiwan. As you said earlier, Amy, President Xi of China said that the United States was playing with fire over Taiwan. By way of background, President Xi has committed himself within China to the reunification of Taiwan with China. He wants that to be a critical part of his legacy. And on the other side, President Biden stated just last month in his town meeting that the United States was committed to the defense of Taiwan. So here we have two leaders taking positions over Taiwan, which, if they're fully pursued, will lead to conflict. And this is another problem for the United States. The New York Times has reported that the Pentagon has war-gamed a war over Taiwan between the United States and China. And in the last 18 of these war games, the United States has lost 18 times. China has the world's most sophisticated anti-ballistic missiles, the most sophisticated missile defense. Taiwan is extremely close to China. And if the United States moved aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Straits, like we did in the last conflict back in the 1990s, China could destroy those aircraft carriers. It could sink those aircraft carriers. So the United States, in the immediate future, is faced with the possibility of fighting a war over Taiwan. And if that conflict emerged, the United States would have to either retreat in defeat and see Taiwan conquered, or the United States would have to go to war and fight a war that it would probably lose. And that's one issue, but there's also a deeper geopolitical struggle going on. Over the past 5 centuries, every world hegemon has done one thing the same way. Every world hegemon, from Portugal to Holland to Britain to the United States, and now China, has dominated the Eurasian landmass, which today is home to 70% of the world's population and productivity. And with the $4 trillion that China made by 2014, as a result of its open trade with the United States, China's invested $1.2 trillion in this massive infrastructure, laying down a steel grid of rail, road, and gas pipeline, integrating the vast Eurasian landmass into a single market in which trade and power, as if by natural law, is going to flow towards Beijing. China is also working to break the U.S. geopolitical hold over the Eurasian landmass. During the Cold War, we controlled what are known as the axial ends of Eurasia through the NATO alliance in Western Europe and 4 bilateral treaties with mutual defense treaties with Japan, South Korea, Philippines, and Australia. And from these 2 axial positions, we ringed Eurasia with bands of steel, aircraft carriers, jets, fighter bombers to dominate Eurasia. And now China is punching through those circles of steel, breaking the U.S. geopolitical grip over Eurasia, and through the Belt and Road Initiative, consolidating its control. Moreover, China has built 40 ports ringing the Eurasian landmass and the coast of Africa. So the combination of this geopolitical circling of the coastlines of Eurasia, combined with this massive grid of infrastructure across the continent, is placing China in control where it is going to dominate the Eurasian landmass. And that is the key to geopolitical power.